The last day in the Garden of Shadows. The gravel crunched beneath your feet as you walked slowly down the familiar path. The heavy sky hung low, casting a muted gray over everything. You paused, breathing in the moist scent of earth and rain, trying to steel yourself against what lay ahead. Somewhere in the recesses of your purse, the gold pocket watch your grandmother had given you rested, heavy and precious against the soft lining. Its polished surface still gleamed despite the years, a reminder of the family legacy that seemed to rest so heavily on you. But today, even its familiar weight could not ease your mind. "Miss Adair," a voice called out sharply, jolting you from your thoughts. You looked up to see Finnick, the doorman, watching you with a disapproving gaze. He had been here for years, ever since you were a child, and his gruff demeanor felt oddly comforting, as if everything were still the same. But today was different. "You're late," he said, a hint of concern hidden beneath his stern tone. You offered him a faint smile, tapping his shoulder lightly with your fan. "Only fashionably so, Finnick. Now, if you would be so kind, announce me." Finnick's frown softened and he nodded, giving a respectful bow. He led you through the marble-floored entrance and down the grand hall, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. Portraits of the Adair family lined the walls, stern and unyielding, their eyes following you as you passed. Each gaze seemed to hold a warning, a reminder of the weight you carried. As you entered the parlor, the soft hum of conversation abruptly ceased. A group of women dressed in fine silks and satins sat around a tea table, their gloved hands holding delicate porcelain cups. Some offered you pointed glances, eyes narrowing in silent judgment, but you ignored them. Your gaze was already drawn to the figure seated by the large bay window, her silhouette framed by climbing vines and ivy. Genevieve looked up, and the moment her eyes met yours, your heart skipped a beat. Her dark curls were pinned back loosely, strands escaping to frame her face, while tiny white flowers were woven into her hair. She was radiant, her beauty soft and subtle, like the first light of dawn. Your pulse quickened as you moved to her side, ignoring the murmurs that followed you. Genevieve's face lit up, her soft smile a balm against the tension in the room. She slid over, creating space on the sofa, and as you took your place beside her, you felt a warmth spreading through you, a familiar sense of belonging. She took your hand, hiding the gesture behind the folds of her skirt, and squeezed gently. "I almost thought you wouldn't come," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. You leaned in, close enough to feel her breath against your cheek. "And miss seeing you?" "Never." Her cheeks flushed, a soft pink that spread down her neck, and she turned her gaze to her teacup, the gentle curve of her mouth betraying a small secret smile. Her thumb traced light circles on your hand, grounding you, anchoring you to the moment. But the respite was short-lived. "Miss Adair," a sharp voice cut through the soft conversation, and you looked up to see Mrs. Elmsworth, one of your aunt's closest friends, watching you with a thinly veiled expression of disapproval. She raised a meticulously arched brow. "A bit late, aren't we?" "Only fashionably, Mrs. Elmsworth," you replied, your voice as smooth as silk. "A small personal matter kept me. I'd really rather not go into it." Mrs. Elmsworth's gaze narrowed, but she did not press further. Instead, she turned her attention to another guest, and you felt Genevieve's hand tighten around yours. She looked at you, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding, as if she could sense the tension coiled within you. But your thoughts wandered to the morning's confrontation with your brother. He had found the small portrait of Genevieve tucked inside the gold pocket watch. a tiny, hastily drawn sketch that held more meaning than he could understand. The look on his face had been one of shock, then anger. "What do you think you're doing, Lily?" he had demanded. This girl. You're throwing everything away for her. Our family name, our reputation. Do you know what people are saying?" You had tried to reason with him, tried to explain that what he saw as shame was something precious, something pure. But he wouldn't hear it. His words had cut deep, each one a reminder of the walls closing in around you. He had made his ultimatum clear. End it with her or face the consequences. The memory stung, but you forced yourself to shake it off. Genevieve was here beside you, her touch a reminder of all that was good and true. Nothing else mattered. When the women turned back to their conversations, Genevieve rose quietly, glancing at you. Without a word, you followed her out into the garden, where a soft breeze rustled the ivy, and the world felt a little less constrained. It was here, beneath the gentle canopy of greenery, that you and Genevieve had shared countless moments, hidden away from prying eyes. Once you were alone, she turned to you, her gaze searching. "What happened?" she asked softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from your face. Her touch was gentle, but it held a depth of understanding that made your heart ache. You swallowed, trying to find the words, but they caught in your throat. Finally, you managed to whisper. "He found the portrait, Genevieve." Her eyes widened and her hand dropped to her side. She didn't speak, but her expression was enough. She understood the gravity of what had happened, the implications that loomed over you both. A heavy silence hung between you, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. Then, with a trembling hand, Genevieve reached up and pulled a ribbon from her hair. She tied it gently around your wrist, a delicate blue ribbon that contrasted against your skin, soft and vibrant. "If they take you from me, let this remind you of us," she whispered. Her voice quivered, and you saw the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. You pulled her close, wrapping your arms around her, and buried your face in her shoulder. The faint scent of lavender clung to her, a fragrance that was uniquely hers. It filled you with a bittersweet comfort, a reminder of the happiness you had found with her. "Genevieve," you murmured, your voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to leave you." She held you tightly, her fingers tracing gentle patterns on your back. "Then don't," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "We'll find a way. We'll figure something out." But you knew the reality of the world you lived in, the expectations that weighed upon you both. You knew that staying would mean more than just the end of your freedom. It would mean the loss of everything you held dear. The thought terrified you, but the alternative was unthinkable. You lifted your head, meeting her gaze, and in that moment, you saw everything you loved about her. The strength, the kindness, the fierce loyalty that had bound you together from the start. You leaned in, brushing your lips softly against hers, a silent promise of all the things you couldn't say. Her hands cupped your face, her touch tender, filled with a love that defied words. As you pulled away, you reached into your purse and drew out the pocket watch. Opening it, you revealed the tiny sketch, the image of Genevieve captured forever within its gold casing. You pressed it into her hand. "Take it," you said. "Keep it close so that no matter where we are, we'll still have each other." Genevieve's fingers closed over the watch, her gaze holding yours. Her hand trembled, and for a moment, you saw a crack in her composure, a flicker of vulnerability that mirrored your own. "You're coming back to me," she whispered, a fierce determination in her voice. "No matter where they send you, you'll come back." You nodded, blinking back tears, and wrapped your arms around her, holding her close as if you could somehow protect her from the storm that loomed over you both. The world outside felt distant, the garden a sanctuary where, for a few precious moments, nothing else mattered. When you finally pulled away, she tied the ribbon a little tighter around your wrist, her fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go. With a soft smile, she leaned forward, her lips brushing against your cheek in a final lingering kiss. "Until we meet again," she whispered, her voice breaking. You forced yourself to turn away, each step feeling like a piece of your heart was left behind. The weight of goodbye settled over you, and as you stepped back into the house, the sounds of laughter and conversation felt hollow, distant. As the door closed behind you, you brought your wrist to your lips, inhaling the faint scent of lavender from the ribbon. You could still feel the warmth of her hand, the weight of her love, and in that moment you made a silent promise. Back inside, the air felt colder, the laughter and chatter of the parlor suddenly harsh and grating. You paused in the foyer, catching your breath. The weight of what lay ahead pressed upon you, mingling with the lingering warmth of Genevieve's embrace. But soon enough your brother would arrive, and with him the carriage that would carry you away to the country. As you slipped back into the parlor, Mrs. Elmsworth's voice rose above the others, her sharp tone carrying through the room. She held court with a story about her son's recent visit to the city, but her eyes flicked over to you, keen and observant, as if daring you to challenge her authority. She smiled tightly, but there was no warmth in it, only a brittle sort of satisfaction that made you want to shatter her smug composure. Your aunt moved closer, pressing a glass of sherry into your hand, her own expression a mask of calm. "Lily, my dear," she murmured, leaning in close, "might I suggest you hold yourself together for the remainder of the afternoon?" You took a sip, the taste of the sherry bitter on your tongue. You wanted to escape, to bolt out of the room and into Genevieve's arms, but the reality of your situation held you captive, and so you nodded, murmuring, "Of course, Aunt." You felt the stares, whispers edging around you like the beginnings of a storm. They didn't know, not fully, but there were enough hints, enough rumors circulating that they could piece together what they wanted to believe. Mrs. Elmsworth's eyes lingered on your wrist, where Genevieve's ribbon was tied, the vibrant blue standing out like a beacon. She raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. You exchanged polite words with Mrs. Elmsworth, nodded at her barbed compliments, all the while feeling Genevieve's absence like an ache. The world of polished silverware, floral tea sets, and elaborate hats felt like a prison. Every corner of the room seemed to conspire against you, pressing in, trapping you in a cage you couldn't see but could feel tightening around you with each passing moment. Eventually, you excused yourself again, this time retreating down a quiet hall away from the watchful eyes of your aunt and her guests. You found a small alcove dimly lit, with a window that looked out over the garden. Through the glass, you could see Genevieve standing near the edge of the garden, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the waning afternoon light. She was waiting, watching, as if she knew you'd find a way to see her one last time. Heart-pounding, you slipped through a side door, moving quickly, hoping no one would see you. Genevieve turned as you approached, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Lily," she whispered, her voice breaking, "they'll take you away soon." You nodded, the words catching in your throat. "All right," you managed to say, your voice trembling. "No matter where I am, I'll find a way to send letters. I promise." Genevieve reached out, her hand cupping your cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down your cheek. I'll wait for every letter, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll wait for you, Lily. You leaned into her touch, memorizing the feel of her hand, the warmth of her skin, the scent of lavender that clung to her. You knew you had to be strong, but in that moment all you wanted was to stay, to be with her, to hold on to this fleeting moment of happiness. The distant sound of carriage wheels crunching on gravel shattered the quiet, and you felt your heart sink. Your brother was here. Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled you close, holding you tightly, as if she could shield you from the harsh reality of the world. You clung to her, your fingers tangled in her hair, your heart breaking with every beat. I'll come back to you, you whispered, your voice barely audible. One day I'll come back. She nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to your forehead. I'll wait for as long as it takes. With one last lingering look, you pulled away, stepping back toward the house. You watched her face as the distance grew between you, her figure slowly fading into the shadows of the garden. The weight of the ribbon on your wrist, still tied with her care, felt like an anchor, grounding you to her even as the world threatened to tear you apart. As you stepped back inside, you were met by the cold, unyielding gaze of your brother. He looked at you with a mixture of frustration and resignation, his lips pressed into a thin line. Enough of this nonsense, he said quietly, his voice laced with a steely resolve. It's time to go, Lily. You cast one last glance over your shoulder, hoping for one final glimpse of Genevieve. But she was gone, hidden from view, as if she were a dream you'd only imagined. The weight of the world seemed to settle onto your shoulders as you climbed into the carriage, your heart splintering with each step away from her. As the carriage pulled away, you clutched the ribbon on your wrist, your thumb running over its soft, familiar texture. You closed your eyes, imagining her touch, her voice, her laughter, and clung to the promise you'd made. To write, to remember, and one day to return. The scent of lavender lingered in your memory, a reminder of the love you were forced to leave behind. And as the carriage carried you farther away, you held on to that memory, a fragile lifeline in a world determined to pull you apart.